Okay, well, thank you very much to our current President, Stuart Weeks, for the invitation to speak on this important topic at this meeting. And thank you to everybody attending for your participation and in advance for your attention and your time. This paper emerges from, I think, some members of the Society having noticed my recent publication, namely this book, The Civic Values of the Humanities, which came out in late 2025 in Palgrave's Critical University Studies series. The book emerged through administrative roles that I took on in Oxford as Bodleian curator, as chair of the Humanities Committee for Library Provision and Strategy, as fellow for student welfare, as research director for the Faculty of Theology and Religion, and the like. I thought that since I was reading about higher education policy anyway, I'd try and process some of the material by writing about it, thus forcing myself to assimilate, analyse, and form arguments around it to clarify my own thinking. And since my career has been shaped largely by interdisciplinary work, I thought publishing in another field altogether would not be totally out of keeping for an already diverse publishing profile. I'm grateful to my peer reviewers in the field of critical higher education studies for their insights, which helped me to improve the book, as I've been considering the questions around what is the civic value of the humanities and Hebrew Bible, and indeed the political economy of knowledge right now as it relates to higher education institutions and the humanities. So in May 2019, many colleagues will have noticed a British Academy report on theology and religious studies, which suggested that these subjects risk disappearing from our universities altogether. This type of subject-specific report is, of course, part of a wider global picture wherein the humanities, arts and social sciences have come under increasing pressure, as has higher education as a whole, including STEM subjects. Indeed, we are facing a critical global turning point in the humanities, arts and social sciences, as well as across higher education institutions. Questions about the value of the humanities are gaining renewed urgency today. Artificial intelligence can quickly, cheaply and reliably perform tasks traditionally deemed to require humanities skills. Simultaneously, severe pressures exist in present-day higher education settings where humanities departments on a global scale face closures and job losses, and we are currently seeing drastic measures such as institutional mergers occurring. There is deep dissatisfaction among higher education employees, as demonstrated by industrial action within the sector as a whole, disputes over pensions, salary inequalities, unsustainable workloads, and precarious contracts. People and resources are stretched, and it's becoming less clear to many people what the public value of humanities education and research has when facing real-world present-day challenges. Seismic global issues contribute to the problem here, such as climate change, increasing political polarisation, and in addition to instability within the higher education sector. And this signals a turning point where it is crucial to clearly identify what kinds of civic value humanities education, and within that, theology and biblical studies have, and why the humanities are important. Katherine Waddington deploys military language US military language in describing our modern turbulent and unpredictable circumstances as VUCA, or on the slide, volatile, change happens rapidly and on a large scale, uncertain, the future cannot be predicted with any precision, complex, changes are complicated by many factors and there are few single causes or solutions, ambiguous, there is little clarity on what events mean and what effect they may have before becoming disastrous. If meaningful intervention is not made immediately, there is a genuine risk that we may lose major parts of humanities education and research. Ironically, I would argue, these problems require the very skills that the humanities cultivate: ethical reflection, imagination, empathy, and critical judgment. A loss of humanities in higher education institutions risks deadening the very parts of the human spirit that pave the way for ethics, compassion, deep attention, curiosity, and self-awareness. In response to this, I wish to address several questions today. Firstly, I'd like to talk about how we talk about this issue. Secondly, I think to better understand the problem, I would like simply to describe it in the hope that this might help us reflect together. Thirdly, I want to talk about some of the ways that humanities work might be communicated in a way that is of obvious civic value. Turning to the first matter, how we talk about the problem, I wish to address the language of crisis. In my book, the language of crisis is largely absent. Instead, I attempted consciously to adopt a positive tone in writing, because I'm keenly aware of how compelling the temptations towards rumination, cynicism, and defeatism are. These attitudes risk us failing to engage and instead adopting a very passive and apathetic attitude towards the matter. Such attitudes have led to damaging metaphors and narratives, such as death-related and pathologizing language, such as zombie universities and publications on the death and demise of universities, which include language such as student hellscapes, for example. Other damaging types of language include infantilizing, dysphomistic terms like Mickey Mouse degrees, and instrumentalizing phrases such as outputs and products. These metaphors and ways of speaking have become deeply ingrained in the social imagination, obscuring the civic contributions that the humanities can make. Furthermore, culture wars, media attack, doublespeak, anti-intellectualism, virtue signalling, and gesture politics within higher education have led to what Stephen Jones powerfully argues are integrity deficits and a loss of trust in the sector. Ironically, as Louise Lawrence persuasively argues, this is particularly fueled by work on values when it gets translated in a neoliberal and transactionalized way into institutional mission and value statements. Neoliberalism is problematic here because competitive individualism, marketization, institutional brand preservation, cultures of hyper-productivity, frenetic time management, auditing and performance cultures create, in ref terms, research cultures that do not reward citizenship or build authentic belonging, but instead favour so-called rock star academics, vast science, and so on, and this deeply damages community and morale. Likewise, speed in academic work can have very serious negative consequences, especially in terms of epistemic insights. As Maggie Berg and Barbara Sieber argue, I quote, "To drive oneself as if one were a machine should be recognised as a form of self-harm, and being machine-like will hardly generate compassion for others." If the value that researchers and teachers produce is not civic, but is instead in the pursuit of speedy, unbridled self-interest, perhaps rationalised in terms of a career or academic capitalism, then we have a problem. As Kathleen Lynch argued, neoliberal values in higher education give way to a licensed and structural form of carelessness and privileged irresponsibility, where to be a successful academic is to be unencumbered by caring. Therefore, what I'm trying to illustrate in this first point about the nature of how we talk about the matter is that when institutions try to intervene with quick fixes, it can do more harm than good. For example, as Louise Lawrence shows, propositional knowledge communicated in institutional statements of and about values leads to perceptions within the workforce of care washing, which may be defined as superficial gesturing around care, which washes over deeper institutional issues. Care washing is a type of hypocrisy where a hollow gap between institutional rhetoric in terms of values can be identified, a gap which contributes to a perceived lack of psychological safety and trust among employees and students. If the language around the value that the humanities and Hebrew Bible Old Testament as part of the humanities does not match the practice, then it can erode perceptions of the value of the humanities in terms of teaching and research. What I'm effectively trying to say in this first point here is that we need to be really careful about how we curate these discussions, because some of the efforts to address it from within institutions may, despite being well-intentioned, I'm sure, have made things worse and have led to a build-up of internal critique. Speaking to my second point, namely that rather than come up with solutions, it is important first to make every effort to really understand the nature of the problem. The difficulties that higher education institutions currently face go back a really long way. We have to start somewhere, so I'm going to start in 2008 with the Research Assessment Exercise, or RAE as it was then called, when a research-led task force into the public value of the humanities, led by the then Chief Executive of the Arts and Humanities Research Council, or AHRC, Philip Esler, was formed. This resulted in the generation of a model that illustrated economic impact, defined by Her Majesty's Treasury, which described value in context of arts and humanities in terms of economic capital, but also in terms of civic capital, as described in a report that was subsequently published in 2010 by the Arts and Humanities Research Council, entitled Leading the World, The Impact of UK Arts and Humanities Research. Simultaneously, an edited collection was published, which persuasively argued for public value as a more refined and comprehensive mode of assessment of the humanities rather than economic impact. And this is Jonathan Bate, The Public Value of the Humanities. By the 2014 Research Excellence Framework exercise, the impact of research started to be measured as part of public accountability around academic work. Impact was defined in Ref 2014 and subsequently Ref 2021 as, I quote, an effect on change or benefit to the economy, society, culture, public policy or services, health, the environment, or quality of life beyond academia. The way value is assessed then, therefore, is explicitly not supposed to be restricted to economic metrics. Literature has repeatedly made a case against reductive and overly simplistic measurements of value. Evidence of this tendency may be traced in publications including Martha Nussbaum's powerful book, Not for Profit, Why Democracy Needs the Humanities, and then subsequently in 2013 in Helen Small's detailed monograph, The Value of the Humanities. These efforts have been helpful. However, I may be wrong, but it is my view that subsequent governments have lost sight of the value of the humanities, and with a period of extreme pressure having taken hold right now across the higher education sector, the risks are intensified. Recent interventions in the field signal a decisive gear change in terms of addressing this important issue. Present-day endeavours include the work emerging through the British Academy's SHAPE initiative. This is the Social Sciences, Humanities and Arts for People and the Economy, which valorises these subjects. This data-driven initiative features an evidence hub that monitors and maps data around higher education and secondary education, graduates and skills, and subject-specific data dashboards to access the health of the humanities in the UK. Likewise, the British Academy have recently published a report, The Shape of Research Impact, that was 2024, which drew on the 2021 REF impact case studies to highlight how SHAPE research has a real-world impact. Individual institutions and research centres have simultaneously published reports which helpfully synthesise data, which draws out how the humanities make a contribution to society. For example, Oxford University's recent report, The Value of the Humanities, Understanding Career Destinations of Oxford Humanities Graduates, analyses quantitative data around Oxford graduate destinations and salaries and qualitative material, such as in-depth interviews with graduate students and employers to highlight the positive career trajectories that humanities graduates often have. UCL have recently published a report in 2024, A Case for the Humanities, making the case that the humanities are essential for innovation, business success, and competitive advantages across all fields and all sectors. One of the things that scholars from diverse disciplines have critiqued in the literature, reports, and even in some of the material reports from the databases which I have just cited, is the ways in which neoliberalism and marketisation have penetrated the culture of UK higher education, wherein assessments of value have relied too heavily on neoliberal economic metrics. On the basis of this evidence, I would want to resist economic reductivism because there is nothing suggesting to me that what is marketable and profitable, according to neoliberal assessments of measuring what is of worth, is the same as what is valuable. In other words, I do not accept the premise that human potential is unleashed by competition in the market, entrepreneurialism and free trade. However, I would also wish to resist what is possibly the opposite temptation towards reductivism, namely, when people fall into discussing the humanities and value in terms of intrinsic worth. These kind of reductive appeals to intrinsic worth leave the civic importance of the humanities undervalued and misunderstood. It is simply not enough, especially in a cost of living crisis, to assert that the humanities are just inherently valuable, because only people who have access to privilege and wealth would be able to enjoy this type of inherent value. Nevertheless, it is urgently important to try and describe what civic value the humanities, and in particular for this venue, the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament has, since higher education policy now ties funding more closely to demonstrable impact in ref terms. That aside, what the academic research I've just cited illustrates is that there is strong evidence that the humanities play an important civic role. This research also establishes critical challenges regarding measuring, demonstrating, and recognising that role. The civic value relates to our humanness and to the ways in which we belong to each other. The humanities function for me as a type of organic technology that communicates human experience through time. Subjects such as history, literature, theology, philosophy, classics inspire us to learn through providing insights into the accomplishments and failures of previous generations. Indeed, we are deeply indebted to those human beings who have endowed us with this brilliant legacy that helps us to identify how to live with greater compassion, empathy, consciousness, and self-awareness. Therefore, studying humanities subjects is ethically significant because it is about humane values. The word humanities reflects this, emerging from the Latin humanitas, meaning human nature, civilization, and kindness. The humanities are important for democracy and our relationships to each other and the planet, as well as for self-transformation and the emergence of self-consciousness, which is vital for citizenship. Humanness means being engaged in research and teaching with our entire active cognitive beings, perhaps not just our bodies. I've just made the case in a very positive way, but maybe making the case for what might be lost will drive home the point more forcefully. Perhaps another way of looking at this problem is through paying attention to the problems that emerge within institutions when the humanities, and indeed when humanity is not attended to, perhaps in order to highlight the costs associated with losing the humanities. The institutional costs of failing to engage in a sophisticated way with what is valuable about the humanities are significant. In systems of education where belonging and community are not cultivated, people may practice pleasanteeism, false positivity, and through the erosion of trusts this creates, may develop low morale. Organisational research cultures wherein people do not feel valued stifle compassion, creativity, complex problem solving, and affect tolerance. Instead, this breeds a type of self-serving, selective engagement or disengagement, where instead of authenticity, performative empathy emerges, so that a fabricated reality, superficiality, and even what Roy Jacks calls muck-learning emerges. Muck-learning defined as education delivered through processes, procedures, and values increasingly analogous to those governing the delivery of American fast food. Low morale, staff anxiety, and compassion fatigue are serious problems for institutions. Institutions that are careless and promote individualism give rise to careless, individualistic people and behaviours. As Kathleen Lynch argues, this breeds organisational culture marked by increasing egocentrism, very conditional loyalties, and a declining sense of responsibility for others, particularly for students. Given the recent debates in Universities UK and in the UK government about whether or not universities should have a statutory duty of care, it is worth noting that for some students this can literally be a matter of life or death. Such research environments do not serve institutions. As Nussbaum pointed out, quote, imperfect people will no doubt act much worse when placed in structures of certain types. If we find our own humanity is numbed, then this will be passed on to our students. If, in other words, a culture of individualism, hyperproductivity, time poverty, low morale, burnout, and so on emerges, then this will be contagious within the institution. Turning to my third, more hopeful point about the ways that the humanities might have a clear and obvious civic value, I wonder if, instead of understanding universities as credentializing so-called useful machines, as Nussbaum put it, it would be helpful to think about the process of education itself and the values embedded within it, rather than focusing on only the outputs. Humanizing institutional processes, as well as focusing on the ways in which the humanities cultivate compassion and resist dehumanization, are surely important here. With the rise of extreme right wing in politics and increasing polarization globally, our abilities to debate are undermined, and truth risks being substituted for ideological assertions. As Bernie Levinson and Robert Erickson have highlighted the implications of this risk in a recent volume entitled The Betrayal of the Humanities, which explores the university during the Third Reich, arguing that, I quote, the focus on the ideological transformation of knowledge and the threats to the autonomy of the university at times of national crisis are deeply relevant to the present moment. Similarly, thinking about the ways the humanities might have clear and obvious civic value, what I've tried to do in the book is to think about centralizing humanness within research cultures and communicating more effectively about why humanness within research and teaching has civic value. Therefore, I've used several case studies to show how, through working together with partners in STEM subjects, it might be mutually beneficial. The first was narrative medicine, research from my Job monograph for those who are familiar. Narrative medicine is a multidisciplinary area that draws together the humanities, arts, clinical practice, and healthcare justice. The conceptual and intellectual foundations of this area of research emerge out of narratology, phenomenology, and liberation-focused social theory. Rita Sharon's work in this area made a huge impact in her own field of research and beyond. She deemed narrative skills to be so important that she set up a program in narrative medicine at Columbia University to teach clinical practitioners active textual and cultural knowledge of narrative skills, and this has become so important that it is now a division of Columbia University. This initiative bolstered human connections in medical settings, and through doing so, it improved patient and clinical health outcomes. Therefore, its civic value was demonstrated and measurable. A second example I discussed in the book relates to a REF impact case study, the Life of Breath project, which took place between 2015 and 2020, led by Jane McNaughton from Durham University and Javi Carrell from the University of Bristol, working together with the British Lung Foundation and funded by the Wellcome Trust. This wide-ranging project explored breathing and breathlessness and resulted in Policy Recommendations report. The project acknowledged the way that breathing is not only a biomedical and physiological issue, but is also a psychological and emotional matter, as well as something that has important interconnections with spirituality, music making, and inner states. The research enabled transformed understandings around breathing and breathlessness to emerge and offered new possibilities for management, therapy, and the reduction of stigma. which then all of a sudden became vitally important and led directly to NHS guidance on breathlessness as the COVID pandemic emerged during their project. The third case study, which I discussed in the book, relates to our very own David Shepherd's excellent project on stained glass windows, which explored the way that light impacts people's experience of stained glass, focusing on how we remember and experience awe and wonder when viewing stained glass. The project, running from 2022 to 2023, was funded by the Templeton Religious Trust, brought together art and light with human cognition and perception. As such, the study of religious experience, religious art and awe was brought together with neuroscience, psychology, empirical aesthetics, and cognitive aspects of beauty, such as attention, perception, and memory. This research was conducted using pupillometry, the study of pupil dilation, and involved building a stimulus database to understand cognitive processes and how they impact the experience of transcendence. Here we have another clear example of measurability around value, embedded within what is important about the human spirit. One of the final things I highlighted in the book was the importance of compassion from theology and religious studies that emerges from humanity's work and the way it can impact the so-called bottom line. For the sake of analytical clarity and to avoid superficiality when speaking about compassion, it is important to pause and consider very briefly its qualities. In order for compassion to operate, it requires empathy and imagination. As my colleague in Oxford, Joshua Horden, whose work on compassion in healthcare settings was also a REF impact case study, which I discussed in the book, discusses, Joshua says, compassion, quote, requires a deep engagement, waiting with and entering into the perspective of the other, avoiding the problem of interdeterminacy, but without surrendering one's own perspective, thus avoiding acquiescence. Therefore, compassion is cognitive alongside being a form of cognitive affectivity. It is not reducible to an emotional sensation, though it involves emotion and physical sensation, but is a form of affective understanding of someone's suffering dependent on intersubjective communication. As Joshua Horden goes on to explain, quote, for compassion to be not only intelligent but accurate, it must be informed, so that the experience of suffering can be understood in a visceral, intersubjective and affective way. Given compassion is dependent on the consent of the other to reveal and specify their own affective state, it requires some level of trust between people. However, for said trust to emerge between people, there needs to be an environment or research environment where effective communication can occur. In my own research onto this in Job, I've argued that there is a qualitative difference between engaged listening, where the other is viewed as a subject rather than merely object of attention. Instead of power over another, this requires the recognition that suffering identified in another personal group is part of a shared vulnerability or shared sense of connectedness that is common to being human. Nussbaum phrases this well, suggesting that, I quote, recognition of one's own related vulnerability is, then, an important and frequently indispensable epistemological requirement for compassion in human beings. Or, as Janet Soskis persuasively argues, with reference to bodily responsiveness in interpretation, I quote, the other, attended to with love, is more deeply known. Therefore, in some ways, compassion starts with an act of recognition of the full humanity of the person or group being encountered, so that they are not treated as an object or a mere token of a type and a simple determinable thing. Katherine Waddington, Parker Palmer, and Louise Lawrence are some important interlocutors when the questions of compassion's role in higher education emerged. Katherine Waddington, having published on what she describes as the compassion gap in UK universities, highlights the damage that institutionalised perceptions about education have. She suggests that if education is deemed as a tool for credentialisation, then student learning is impaired because students may self-ascribe and be perceived as consumers rather than learners with power. Parker Palmer makes a very similar point, suggesting that pedagogies that make students into passive consumers of knowledge do not cultivate a sense of personal voice and agency. It might be tempting to dismiss compassion and humanity within higher educational settings as of lesser importance than more measurable and instrumental skills. However, this would be self-defeating because there is a growing body, I quote from Waddington here, there is a growing body of evidence to support the argument that compassion in the work environment improves staff well-being and positively impacts the bottom line. And here I defer to a lot of the research emerging through Oxford's Wellbeing Research Centre. Obviously, it is impossible to be comprehensive in a 30-minute slot. The arguments that I make in the book cannot compete with the problems that currently bedevil higher education institutions. But I hope that I've opened up the subject a little bit for us to reflect together. In terms of closing remarks, one thing that gives me a lot of hope is the disproportionate number of biblical scholars engaging with these questions, many of whom I've named, and indeed many of whom contacted me with their own case studies and things that have engaged with the humanities more broadly and with the sciences in response to seeing the paper. So I'm really interested now in how this talk connects with the next paper and discussion, and thank you so very much for listening and for your attention. Stuart, I think your mic is off.
Can you hear me now? I shall not repeat my fulsome thanks at length then. I just wanted to kick off the discussion myself by playing devil's advocate a little and asking whether you think that the concept of humanities as a single thing is actually helpful, particularly to the extent that it has become a not natural sciences thing.
So thank you, Stuart. It's so I think the division that I see in critical higher education studies is HASS and STEM, so humanities, arts and social sciences, and then STEM subjects. And I think that that's both simultaneously helpful and not helpful. So to sort of almost avoid answering your question, to come down on both sides. So, I mean, I think it's helpful in as much as it's a sort of shorthand for thinking about kind of broad areas of research, knowledge, impact, knowledge exchange, teaching, and so on across higher education and so on. I think it's not helpful because what it obscures is subject-specific discussions. And I think what tends to happen is if material is published that's very specific, it kind of gets missed in the broader discussions. Simultaneously, the kind of broader discussions that about the humanities get missed in the sort of smaller subject-specific discussions. So, I mean, I sort of fell into this research area because of institutional responsibilities and things, and found myself writing a book. But I wanted to engage more broadly, kind of, so on a broad level, rather than start at the subject specific, because of the urgency of the issue. I would really like to continue my work here and to develop the thinking and to do research that connects with partners in other disciplines. I think I'd need to be resourced to do so because I am part of the the sort of people being described in the paper, I'm subject to the same kind of time pressures. Um, but I think it's also, yeah, really helpful. It's been helpful for me personally to take a broader view. Um, I mean, obviously, I've cited the 2019 British Academy report, and obviously, David, whose hand I can see up, his work is featured. Hugh Williamson also wrote to me and others have too, with things that they've done in a subject specific way. Um, but yes, I think it's like trying to square a circle. How do we enter into the discussion? I think that goes back to my first point. How we talk about this is is potentially problematic, and we need to be really careful about it. I don't think that using the term humanities as a kind of broad uh, kind of category is too much of a problem, um, but I can see the potential problems embedded within it.
Thank you very much. There were quite a lot of hands up. I noticed that Mark Geller put something into the chat as well. Um, I don't know if you want to respond to that or if Mark wants you to respond to that.
No, just go ahead and read it. That's right.
So Mark has said, isn't interest in economic or civic value in the humanities typical of those societies which demand high tuition fees as a prerequisite to access? Mm. Well, quite. Uh, yeah, I mean, this speaks to the broader neoliberal concerns I've tried to outline in the book, and questions around marketization of higher education, and particularly in the US, but also in the UK, it's becoming more of a problem. In the UK, our tuition fees actually they haven't grown since God knows when. And so universities are finding themselves in more and more of a deficit state. Um, Surely everybody's aware of the situation. I don't think I need to expand, but yeah,
Thank
not
you.
quite.
I didn't see what order hands went up in, so I'm just going to take the ones that are up at the moment. David Shepherd.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much, Katie. Fantastic and really, really important work, I think. I suppose my question, really interested in your views on, and this is, I suppose, related directly, kind of really specifically to the Hebrew Bible, to our discipline in a way. And I mean, we consider the tensions, the religious tensions simmering in the UK and elsewhere in the world, not least tensions between the so-called Abrahamic religions, and the damage that this can do to our civic fabric. And I wonder what your thoughts are about whether the disciplinary expertise, the focus on the Hebrew Bible that's gathered at SOTS, within SOTS, of course, beyond SOTS too, that kind of thing might encourage us to think about how to make the case for the civic value of the Hebrew Bible specifically as a kind of resource for, fostering interreligious dialogue, et cetera, that there's a kind of civic value that we might be able to specifically kind of contribute to. Anyway, it's just a question.
I think that's a good question. I mean, that is the question we're facing. I mean, one of the things that I really struggle with here is that we could potentially, hypothetically, pool our resources and come up with an explanation of why the Hebrew Bible has civic value. And it could be, beautifully researched, in depth, and so on. And that would be great. But I think the problem is with the attention economy and making people receptive to that research. And that's where I think the disconnect is in terms of, we're all producing really good research. We're all going through peer review process and quality controls and so on. But how much attention is that research actually getting outside of Hebrew Bible? Now, I would be okay if it wasn't actually getting that much because I still think it's a value.
Sure.
But I think nowadays, in the current context, there needs to be that visibility, there needs to be that perception management, and there needs to be growing public and there needs to be more of a case that is heard. And so the problem really is not kind of how does Hebrew Bible have a civic value? Of course it does. I mean, it's the Bible, right? It's undeniable that the research that we do has civic value. But I think the problem is getting people to be receptive to how the research contributes to civic value. And really, I've tried to kind of open up some of the questions here, but I'm afraid I don't have answers. I will continue to reflect on this, but at the moment,
Sure.
if people do, I'm all ears, honestly. But thank you. I've tried my very best to answer your question, David.
Sure. Thank you very much. Thanks.
Stuart, we can't hear you.
Alexandra.
Yes, thank you so much, Catherine. It's such an important contribution to the discussion, and I think we should see our research in this broader sense and in this political or social dimension. And I've got 2 points. Well, obviously, populism is on the rise, and democracy is threatened, and populists don't really like compassion and empathy too much. So there should be a counter way to this. I was thinking about 2 points which I wanted to stress. One is this carelessness, which you criticized, rightly. How should we deal? How should we act differently somehow without becoming activists at the university? So I'd like to, think about this more. And the other thing is, in Denmark, there's empathy or compassion is a school subject now, and it was evaluated by the teachers and parents and the children as the most important school subject. And I thought it should be introduced also in Germany, perhaps also in the UK, and that would be also another role for the humanities to work interdisciplinarily on this to build up this discipline somehow. But that was just a comment, perhaps. But I don't know what you think about it.
Thank you. I think that's really, really helpful, actually. I mean, I think one of the big problems that the literature that I cited in the talk kind of really highlights and drives home is to do with measurability. It's in the humanities, a monograph can take about a decade before people start to recognize, that's made a change to the field. Whereas in sciences, things move a lot faster. Plus, you've got the kind of the unknowns when it comes to trying to measure what impact or even how your what impact a study has had, because it might take 50 years before suddenly something becomes relevant and everybody cites it. It's that thing where the best thing to do is die, and then everybody starts to cite your work. But there's also that sort of thing, like I illustrated in the example of the Life of Breath project. You never know when research is going to suddenly become directly culturally relevant. And I think there is that risk there in sort of making everything conform to kind of market values and capitalism and neoliberalism that sort of sees value in those restricted terms. There's no slack in the system really for the sort of broader research to happen and human inquiry. You asked 2 questions though, and one was sort of how should we act differently? And I think this is a really interesting question because, I mean, I've been thinking about this in terms of morale and belonging and research cultures with my current research director hat on for the Faculty of Theology and Religion. And I think it's really difficult when people are pressed, stressed, stretched, to sort of advocate for the value of compassion in these systems of higher education. But I think that really the onus is on people who have privilege to take up responsibility, because asking asking somebody who's on a precarious contract to be more compassionate, they've got so much to deal with already. Like, obviously we'd want them to act as good human beings, but I think really what needs to happen is deep system changes within higher education institutions. And that has to include people at the top of the institutions being willing to listen and make changes. The other thing you talked about was secondary education and compassion and empathy being taught in Denmark, I think you mentioned. Wouldn't it be wonderful to somehow connect Hebrew Bible studies, empathy? I mean, the work you're doing, you've just published that wonderful volume on trauma and empathy, like to connect that work with secondary education. This isn't a new idea. Lots of people have talked about sort of secondary education, Hebrew Bible, but it seems to be the disconnect is in actually making that happen. But I think, we do. I think it'd be an amazing idea to have things like empathy and compassion taught in schools and self-awareness. What a difference that could potentially make to society, to have what Martha Nussbaum talked about as, citizens who are genuinely there, not only for themselves, but for everybody, the ways in which we belong to each other. So I hope I've managed to answer your question. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Before we carry on, there are 3 hands up. I just want to say at this point that by all means continue addressing questions to Katherine, but it's not really fair if we just keep her here right till the end of the session interrogating her. Please do feel free to make points of your own or to respond to points that other people have been making. And if you are addressing a question directly to Katherine, please say that you're doing so. Next on my list is Heather.
Thank you. Thank you very much, everybody who's joining in. I often try to think of a way to think about this in the first place, because it is like an ocean you're diving into. And I also remember John Pilch's distinction between curing and healing, which he did in his work on the New Testament. And curing has got the instrumentalist idea. You mend the broken person with a pill or an injection. And healing is that you reintegrate them into themselves, their community, and their sense of self. You reintegrate them into their sense of who they are. And I think that helps me to think about, what I would then do. And the other thing that struck me recently is how we are no longer welcomed into the healing process by a receptionist at either a surgery or a hospital. It has been deemed economically viable to eliminate them and replace them with touch screens, which means that you're not welcomed and relaxed as your first means of meeting the ginormous system that is supposedly going to heal you or cure you. And the welcome in, to me, as it would be for education and everywhere, being welcomed as a partner has got to be, to me, it's a terrifically important step that is just regarded as disposable at the moment. I don't need answers. I just hope it will help people to, think, or anyone who can answer or message me in the chat if they want to save time. I'd be very, very delighted. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Heather. Hugh.
Thank you very much, Katherine, for that. And before I say what I'm going to say, I ought to sort of put my cards on the table. I chaired the REF panel in my subject area, which was Middle Eastern and African studies, for the first, well, I was on the panel the first time and then chaired it for the next two. So I was quite a lot involved with that early days, and I'm not unaware of the challenges that it brings. But one or two things that came to me out of all that is that we need to consider the role of research in terms of what you, Katherine, have been talking about, in terms of the care and compassion for the teacher. I abominate this division in some universities between a teaching track and a research track. I mean, I was very committed to teaching always, and I think most of us are, and we regard that as a very important part of our work. But of course, we as people need to be refreshed. I mean, lecture notes can get very yellow at the edges and scruffy if you just do the same thing every year. And so I think there's a very important role for research in actually keeping invigorated the teacher. And I think that connection perhaps could be added into your list of things. And in addition to that, research functions at different levels. I mean, that kind of research may be some very obscure thing that that happens to fascinate you. It may not superficially contribute to the wider good, but it's good for me to do it. On the wider level, in terms of civic value, you mentioned the thing I sent to you, which was, some of you will remember when Rowan Williams was Archbishop of Canterbury, he talked about the introduction of Sharia law in this country. And of course, it blew up into most enormous thing because people thought he was talking about criminal law. He wasn't talking about criminal law. He was talking about family law, where already the Jewish community are allowed within the law to regulate many of their own affairs. And Sharia law applies and very important matters there. And so in the academy, we set up a working party and produced a report which was reported on in the press at the time and was launched in the Palace of Westminster, about legal systems of minorities. So it was interdisciplinary between biblical people like myself, lawyers who knew what the law was, and social scientists who thought about community. And I mean, I'm not a specialist in that kind of thing, but simply by virtue of doing our research, we gain a certain authority to address what I think somebody, I think was it David, said earlier, is terribly important. I mean, religion in the broadest sense is such a divisive issue often in our societies. And so we need to educate the wider public. It may not be our specialist area, but our research gains us the authority to deal with such matters. And thirdly, of course, there is a very wide audience out there that's fascinated simply by the kind of results of research that we do. Melvyn Braggs in our time is a very good example of that. And we've had colleagues who, you know, there was one on Josephus, I remember one time, and one on the Dead Sea Scrolls. And there is simply a human interest, the popularity of museums that are based on academic work. And so our research in terms of educating the wider public, which has an interest, is a form of teaching, but it comes out of research. So I think we need to consider the purposes of research, which are, of course, they include the monograph, but a much wider range of things as well. Thank you.
Thank you. I am told that the person who is identified on screen as Zoom user is Dr. Ming Tong. Is that right?
Yes. Hi, it's me. Thank you so much. You know, I don't have any question, but I love to, you know, put something to the table, which is constructive and contributory to the, you know, wonderful talk, you know, she already delivered. I can represent on the other end, well, I mean, the other continent, but I only visiting, you know, Oxford for a, you know, short period of time. And I learned a lot, you know, from the cultural difference between the UK and US. And, you know, just two quick comments. Number one is that I trained as a MD doctorate in medicine on top of my, you know, theology. And I was very concerned, you know, when you mentioned about the narrative medicine. Why she's successful in Columbia University? Well, of course, she's very articulate, you know, a prolific writer and gave me a lot of funding. My focus is on the funding, money, and how to support the arts and humanities, from other disciplinary. And actually, the reason why she's successful because we clinical medical doctor, we suffer, very frequent, we call the burnout syndrome. Okay. And we get exhausted, overwork hour, underpay, lot of emotional, commitment to patient and patient's family. So we come to a point that, we call the unmet medical need or the gap need. And that's why make which is so popular and so famous. The reason I want to bring up this point is that, right now is a global financial inflation, not too much, different from, I would say, in 2009 when I was in New York City. And when I asked one of the donor, a very rich, land developer, Sandberg, and he had a lot of cash, and he support a lot of art and humanities, and he donate a lot of money to his alumni office at Yale. Basically, he graduated from Yale, and then he went to Harvard MBA, and then suddenly he stopped donating. And I asked him why you no longer support the arts and humanity. And, he shook his head and say, well, I find that I've been supporting those, art and humanities and research, is a very restrictive and very rare area. Only a few people understand what they're doing. So he tried to donate, and he loved to be a philanthropist. He loved to donate some, we call the common goods. More people can benefit, more people can enjoy, whether it's art, music, or painting, whatever. That's why I would like to make a remark that, in order to survive in a very competitive economy, limited resources environment, whether you're in UK or in USA, I strongly recommend you can prove, why your discipline is a necessity and not a trivia. One thing lastly, I would, quickly suggest is to do a indirect cost economic analysis. For instance, like you mentioned something very good, the interdisciplinary, why different disciplines can come together and form a bigger value. And you need to show some figures, some numbers. You can pay and talk to the university administrative people. We need to decide something, to support and, challenge, the idea that, art and humanity are necessities, not a trivia in human
Right.
life.
Thank you very much. Charlotta, if you wouldn't mind waiting just a second, Catherine wanted to respond to something that Hugh said.
May I just very quickly, I'll try and be as clear as possible, but actually just respond to both. Is that okay, Stuart?
Yes,
So
indeed.
just going back to just the last question, and I'm so sorry I didn't catch your name and it's got Zoom user, but thank you very much for your question. I think it's really important. So the numbers thing, having qualitative and quantitative data is really important. And so that is there in the Oxford report that I shared. It's also there in the material from the Oxford Wellbeing Centre. It's also there in the British Academy Shape Hub. That's data driven and is absolutely really important. And in terms of the sort of donation, I think we are pressed for money, and so I think we may have to be using donors more, but it gets really complicated because donations have to fit into a strategic plan. Otherwise, it may well be the cart driving the horse. What drives our research agendas. The translation to the public thing is also really, really important to make our research kind of easily comprehensible, because if we don't do that, other people will. Given it's the Bible, you only have to type something from the Bible into the internet and you'd come up with loads of speculation. I mean, in Charlotta's paper, she mentioned the Museum of the Bible. There's lots of questions. I mean, brilliant paper. Thank you very much, Charlotta. I can see your hand up. But I mean, there are lots of different people who have in this kind of political economy of knowledge around the Bible who want to have a stake in it. So that is really important. And to Hugh's points, compassion for the teacher. I mean, I think this question around precarious contracts is something I did look at in the book, and also thought about not just our minds but our bodies. To be compassionate to ourselves, we cannot drive ourselves like machines. So that the sort of working together, I think, really is a way forwards to pool expertise, and therefore you kind of up the authority that the research has. Okay, I've been as concise as I can.
Right, thank you. Charlotta.
Thank you very much, Catherine. I really applaud you for raising this and for writing the book. I think that's great. I just wanted to maybe add a little bit of nuance to it. I do think there is amongst colleagues a lot of compassion that might not necessarily be visible. And I don't think everybody is necessarily out for their own career. I hope that some of us enjoy what we're doing. And more importantly, I think a really tricky thing in this time of challenge is that the academic sort of consciousness of many people is still, I do with my time what I want to do. And I think that is really not sustainable. So I would say, from my experience, sometimes being compassionate is to say, let's not accept 10 invitations from your friends to write chapters when you haven't written a monograph in ages. This is, in my view, potentially compassionate because, we really do. The university is partly dependent on, the external climate. So I think we mustn't think of, I'm not saying you were suggesting easy answers, but I think the solutions to the difficult questions that you're rightly raising are not necessarily always that straightforward, if that makes sense.
Thank you. There are some more hands up. I will come to you in a second. I just want to abuse my position to introduce another point into the discussion, because I'm very aware of working in a British university which is not Oxford or Cambridge, and the very specific things that are happening to the humanities, which are not really the result of attacks on the humanities or a perception of uselessness, but a purely financial consideration. Fees for undergraduates in Britain have not been raised for many, many years, and though they will be going up this coming year, it's only by a small amount. The humanities are relatively cheap to teach. Consequently, universities have been scrambling to bring in as many humanities undergraduates as they can without changing the number of staff teaching them, and if possible, reducing the numbers of staff. In my own department, traditionally, we used to recruit about 45 students a year. That went up to around 60. I think the last 2 years we've recruited over 100, and we're planning to recruit even more next year. That, of course, is having consequences in the broader system. It will be sucking students out from less prestigious universities. But it is having serious consequences for us. And while I absolutely take Hugh's point about the importance of research, there are significant limits on the amount of research you can do when every batch of essays that you have to mark is 100 students. And when the people who might be taking on some of your classes are not there. We didn't see Walter Mobley replaced. We are having to cut courses. the courses that we've got are bulging with students, and the job is changing radically. So I want people to realize that actually, in some ways, humanities in Britain, at least, are facing a crisis which is one of success rather than a failure. So many students are wanting to do humanities, and they are so cheap to teach that they are progressively wrecking the humanities. Anyway, thank you for letting me get that off my chest. Kirsty, I think you were next.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Catherine, for the excellent paper. That was really, really fascinating. What I wanted to just kind of pick your brain on, if I may, is to do with, I mean, this is a change in students, at least I have observed within the last maybe, I don't know how long I've been teaching, 10 plus years, is the this kind of attitude regarding the kind of climate that you are describing, where some of my students have now how can I put this, changed into from wanting to learn because they want to learn to I have purchased a degree and you are requiring me now to write an essay. Why? I have paid you money to come to this course. And all of this kind of market mentality that you were talking about earlier. And it doesn't describe all students, but when shall I say, when I meet these ones, I get somewhat murderous ideas in my head. And so that I don't end up in jail, would you like to give me any kind of any advice and experience you have had how to go about changing some of that so that education doesn't become just I have bought a degree?
I'm suggesting at this point to Catherine that I just give her 5 minutes at the end to respond to various points that have accumulated and to which she wants to give a reply, if that's okay. Brittany.
Thanks, Stuart and Catherine, for facilitating the conversation. I wondered if maybe one of the cross points between the broader impact on us as scholars in the humanities and our own discipline was trying to trace the roots of the conversation around why we have sabbatical and research leave and like what the goods are of that. And so it was a question for Catherine, just did you come across discussions of sabbaticals in your research, or maybe others have, of what is the actual impact for the scholar and why do we do that, and how can that be a good that our field is kind of revitalizing the importance of that for broader academics. It's just a thought that I had of other specific things that we could bring to the table.
I think, Katie, if you want to make your responses to people now.
I've been writing down people's questions furiously. I'd love to respond. So can I take them in the order? So Charlotte made a point about nuance, sort of saying that actually we need to think more carefully about compassion. And I mean, obviously in a 30-minute slot, one can't really give much nuance. But I have gone through in a nuanced way in the book. It was actually one of the things the peer reviewer insisted I did in terms of thinking about the civic value of compassion in higher education systems. And it is based in the literature. So Louise Lawrence and Catherine Waddington and many others have identified a compassion gap in UK universities. But I think I completely agree with your point, Charlotte, that, you know, compassion must have boundaries. Some people talk about compassion as having a strong back and a soft front sort of thing. But to sort of, I think it's important not to kind of homogenize everybody in the single system as lacking compassion somehow. That was absolutely not the kind of force of my argument in any way, shape or form. But it only takes one or two people in a system for everybody else to lose morale. And I think, you know, there are different ways of thinking about currency in higher education. One of the forces we've been talking about, and as we'll come on to in terms of Stuart's question and money, one is money, but I think other currencies that are really important are our health, our time, the economy of goodwill. These are all things within which we can resource ourselves. And so there are, I think, deep institutional questions around trust and belonging, which actually should require some of our attention. Now, that's broad and not subject specific, but I just really appreciated your question. I'm really glad that you raised it, because it's an important question, and one which really helps to sort of clarify some of the arguments. Stuart, you made the very important point about fees, and I completely agree. Fees have been frozen for a long time. They're only going up marginally, and there's a gap that's been emerging year on year in terms of the fees that are being paid and actually the value of the degrees for universities to run. I think this is a result of massification in UK universities from the 1990s onwards, which is great, because it means on the one hand, there's a more diverse range of people coming to universities, but on the other hand, for the humanities, what that means is the system's absolutely sort of, lecture halls are stuffed full of people. You've got, as you mentioned, a pile of I think everybody can relate to that. When the email comes in with the attachments and you see you've got about 100 things to do, and you've got, several minutes only to do it, and you're kind of like, oh my goodness, how is this going to work? I'm going to have to think about using my own personal time for that. I think one of the things that's maybe encouraging for theology and religion, that I think a lot of theology and religion departments, now I can't speak for all, certainly in mine, I think in Durham as well, I'm not going to mention lots and lots of places, but I think a lot of the time theology departments do make a profit for the university, which gets kind of top sliced, and it goes off to the division in Oxford anyway, and then the division think about how they might like to sort of use that money. So that's good, because it means hopefully theology won't go. One does wonder if we weren't making a profit, what would happen? But I mean, nowadays the financial constraints, I think the particular pressure point is with funding for graduates, with big funders now not providing as much funding and matched funding as they had in the past. That's I think something that I don't know what we do about that. That there's no attitude change or change in behaviour among the workforce that could match those funding questions. Maybe the question of donors is something that might be considered more, but then that brings with it its own complications, because sometimes donors will only give money on a certain kind of basis and things. So that is, and to Brittany's question, wouldn't it be wonderful to match up Hebrew Bible sabbatical and sabbatical? You could do something on eco-theology and how the land needs sabbatical, and the sort of intensification, almost MOOC learning environments. Wouldn't it be great to actually think more about slowing down? So Maggie Berg and Barbara Sieber have written a wonderful book called The Slow Professor, which I in answer to your question, is there anything written on the which talks about slowing down in research. But of course, slowing down and sabbaticals are something that only those with the privilege of a position that includes sabbatical can take. So I think there's a tension that I feel there in saying that. Sorry, Stuart, I think I may have talked for too long.
No, that's absolutely fine. I would draw people's attention to some comments and questions in the chat, which I don't think we have time to get into now, and some of them would take the discussion in a very different direction. With less than a minute to go, though, I think at this point, all I can say is thank you very much, Katherine. I think this has been a fascinating conversation, and I hope that it's something to which the society will continue to turn its attention over the coming years.
Thank you.